In the autumn of 1558, in a quiet chamber at St. James's Palace, a dying queen lay surrounded by physicians who could do nothing more for her. Outside the palace walls, London held its breath. Messengers stood ready with horses saddled, waiting for a single word that would send them galloping toward a manor house at Hatfield, 20 miles to the north. There, a 25-year-old woman was walking in her garden beneath an old oak tree, according to legend, when the riders finally arrived. She was told that her half-sister was dead, and that she was now Queen of England. She is said to have fallen to her knees and murmured a line from Scripture. "This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes." That woman was Elizabeth Tudor. The queen who had just died was Mary Tudor, her elder half-sister, a woman history would remember by a much darker name, Bloody Mary. What led two sisters, daughters of the same father, to become one of the most fraught and consequential rivalries in English history? This is the story of two women who were never supposed to rule, who spent years fearing for their lives at each other's hands, and whose competing visions for England would decide the religious and political fate of a nation for centuries to come. To understand the rivalry between Mary and Elizabeth, you have to go back to the man who created it, their father, Henry VIII. Henry was desperate for a male heir, and when his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, gave him only a daughter who survived infancy, a girl named Mary, he began to see his marriage as cursed. Catherine had been married briefly to Henry's own brother before his death, and Henry became convinced that God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow. The Pope refused, and so Henry did something that would tear Europe apart. He broke England away from the Catholic Church entirely, declared himself the supreme head of a new Church of England, and married Anne Boleyn, the woman he had fallen for at court. In 1533, Anne gave birth to a daughter of her own, Elizabeth. Two half-sisters born of two different mothers, two different faiths, and two increasingly bitter rival camps at court, had entered the world within 7 years of each other. Neither girl was the son Henry wanted. Both would eventually rule England anyway. Mary's childhood had begun in privilege. As Henry's only surviving child for over a decade, she was doted on, educated by the finest tutors in Europe, and for years was treated as the presumed heir to the throne. But when Henry set Catherine aside and married Anne Boleyn, Mary's entire world collapsed. She was declared illegitimate. Her title of princess was stripped away. She was separated from her mother, whom she adored, and was never allowed to see her again before Catherine died in 1536, reportedly of a broken heart as much as illness. Worse, Mary was forced into the household of her own baby half-sister, Elizabeth, where she was made to serve as a lady-in-waiting to the infant who had effectively replaced her. Imagine being a teenage girl, once a princess, now demoted to curtsying before a baby in a cradle. That humiliation shaped Mary for the rest of her life. She never forgot it, and for years she blamed Anne Boleyn's family and the Protestant faction at court for destroying her mother and her own status. Then, in a twist of fate neither girl could have predicted, it was Elizabeth's turn to fall. In 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested on charges of adultery and treason, charges most historians now believe were fabricated by political enemies at court, eager to see her removed. She was beheaded on Tower Green when Elizabeth was not yet 3 years old. Just as Mary had been before her, Elizabeth was declared illegitimate and stripped of her title. Two little girls, once bitter rivals for their father's favor, were now both officially bastards in the eyes of the law, both motherless, both dependent entirely on the whims of a father who had already shown he was capable of destroying the mothers who bore them. It is one of the strange ironies of their story that this shared trauma, rather than uniting them, would later curdle into suspicion and fear. Henry eventually restored both daughters to the line of succession, though never fully to legitimacy, placing them behind their younger half-brother Edward, born to Henry's third wife, Jane Seymour, who died shortly after childbirth. When Henry himself died in 1547, 9-year-old Edward became king, a fervently Protestant boy raised by Protestant advisors who pushed England further from Catholic tradition than even Henry had gone. Mary, now in her 30s, watched with growing horror as the Catholic Mass she cherished was banned, as monasteries and churches were stripped of Catholic imagery, and as the faith of her mother was systematically erased from English life. She retreated to her country estates and defiantly continued to hear Catholic Mass in private, risking her own life to do so, refusing every order from her brother's council. Edward's reign was cut short by illness. He died in 1553, at just 15 years old, but not before his advisors convinced him to name a Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, as his successor, deliberately bypassing both Mary and Elizabeth. It was a plot to keep Catholic Mary off the throne permanently. Jane was proclaimed queen, but her reign lasted a mere 9 days. Mary, showing a steel that surprised everyone who had underestimated the quiet, pious woman, rallied nobles and commoners to her cause, rode into London at the head of a growing army of supporters, and claimed her rightful crown. Jane Grey was arrested, and would eventually be executed the following year, a teenage pawn in a struggle she never wanted any part of. Mary Tudor, the daughter once demoted to serving her own baby sister, was now Queen of England in her own right, the first woman to rule the country as a monarch in her own name. Mary's reign began with genuine popular support and even reconciliation. She initially treated her half-sister Elizabeth, then 20 years old, with warmth, riding beside her into London during the coronation celebrations. But that goodwill would not last. Mary was determined to undo everything Edward's Protestant government had built and restore England fully to the Catholic Church and the authority of the Pope. She also needed to secure a Catholic succession, which meant marriage and a child of her own.
Someone to inherit the throne who was not her Protestant half-sister. She chose Philip of Spain, a decision that horrified much of the English public, who feared their country becoming a mere satellite of the vast Spanish Habsburg Empire.
The marriage triggered rebellion. In early 1554, Thomas Wyatt led an armed uprising explicitly aimed at stopping the Spanish match. And though the rebellion was crushed, it left Mary deeply shaken and suspicious that her own half-sister might have been secretly involved. This is the moment the sisterly relationship curdled into something close to mortal danger. Elizabeth was arrested and interrogated over her possible connection to the Wyatt rebellion. Though no solid evidence tied her directly to the plot, Mary's advisors pushed hard for her execution, arguing that as long as Elizabeth lived, she would remain a living, breathing rallying point for every Protestant who wanted Mary gone. In March of 1554, Elizabeth was brought by barge to the Tower of London and led in through the Watergate that would become infamously known as Traitor's Gate, the same entrance her own mother had passed through 18 years earlier. Elizabeth reportedly refused to step out of the boat at first, declaring she would rather sit there in the rain than walk through that gate as a prisoner. She spent 2 harrowing months imprisoned in the Tower, genuinely uncertain whether she would leave alive or share her mother's fate on the scaffold. She was eventually released and placed under house arrest rather than executed, in large part because Mary's own advisors could never produce definitive proof of her guilt, and because executing a popular Tudor princess without solid evidence carried enormous political risk. But the fear planted in those months at the Tower never fully left Elizabeth. For the rest of Mary's reign, she lived cautiously, keeping her Protestant sympathies carefully hidden, attending Catholic services when required, and giving her sister no further pretexts to move against her. Meanwhile, Mary pursued her religious restoration with an intensity that would define her legacy forever. Heresy laws that had been abolished under Edward were reinstated, and Mary's government began systematically prosecuting Protestants who refused to recant their faith and return to Catholicism. Over the roughly 4 years of her reign, close to 300 men and women were burned at the stake for heresy, including bishops, clergy, and ordinary lay people alike. Some of the most prominent among them burned publicly in Oxford as a demonstration of the government's resolve. These executions were carried out under the legal and religious logic of the time, an attempt to save souls by punishing heresy in this life to prevent eternal damnation in the next. But to the English public and to the Protestant propagandists who would later chronicle these deaths in vivid and lasting detail, they represented pure horror. It was these burnings, later immortalized in printed martyrologies that circulated for generations, that would permanently attach the name Bloody Mary to a queen whose actual reign was, in many other respects, focused on financial reform, naval investment, and attempts at genuine religious conviction, rather than simple cruelty. History rarely remembers nuance, and Mary's name became synonymous with religious persecution for centuries afterward. Mary's personal life brought her little comfort to offset the political turmoil. Her marriage to Philip of Spain was largely one-sided. Philip spent much of the marriage abroad, managing his vast European territories, and Mary, though she reportedly fell genuinely in love with her younger husband, endured at least one devastating false pregnancy, a phantom pregnancy, in which her body showed symptoms, but no child ever arrived. A humiliation played out in front of the entire court and the wider public. Without an heir, the succession question that Mary had hoped to permanently settle remained agonizingly open. And the obvious answer, whether Mary liked it or not, was her Protestant half-sister waiting quietly at Hatfield. By 1558, Mary's health was failing. Worn down by illness, political disappointment, and the loss of Calais, England's last remaining territory in France, a defeat she reportedly said would be found engraved on her heart after her death. Facing the reality that she had no other viable heir, Mary reluctantly acknowledged Elizabeth as her successor in her final weeks, even as she continued to hope, in vain, that Elizabeth might somehow be persuaded to preserve Catholic practice in England after her death. Mary died on the 17th of November, 1558, at the age of 42. Within hours, Elizabeth was proclaimed queen. Elizabeth's accession marked one of the most dramatic reversals in English royal history. Where Mary had spent her reign restoring Catholicism, Elizabeth moved quickly, though carefully, to re-establish a Protestant Church of England, crafting what historians often call the Elizabethan religious settlement, an attempt to find a middle way that would not provoke the kind of violent backlash her father's and siblings' religious swings had produced. Elizabeth had learned, in the most personal and terrifying way possible, exactly what it cost to be on the losing side of a religious struggle in Tudor England, and she spent much of her reign trying to avoid recreating the bloodshed that had defined her sister's rule. She famously said she had no desire to make windows into men's souls, meaning she was far less interested in policing private religious belief than in demanding outward loyalty to the state and its official church, a notably more pragmatic approach than Mary's zealous insistence on doctrinal purity. And yet, Elizabeth's reign was hardly free of the same dangers that had shaped her sister's. She too faced rebellions, plots, and a rival claimant to her throne in the form of her Catholic cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, whose eventual execution in 1587 echoed in eerie ways the very dynamic Elizabeth herself had once lived through, as the imprisoned, suspected sister at the Tower. Elizabeth never married and never produced an heir of her own, famously styling herself the Virgin Queen, and tying her personal identity to the security and stability of the English state itself, rather than to a husband or dynasty. Under her 45-year reign, England would see the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, an explosion of literary and theatrical culture that produced William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe, and the beginnings of English exploration and colonization that would eventually seed a global empire. It is this long, comparatively stable reign, contrasted against Mary's short, turbulent one, that has shaped how history remembers the two sisters so differently. Elizabeth as Gloriana, the Golden Age monarch, and Mary reduced to little more than the grim epithet bloody. But a closer, fairer look at both women reveals something more complicated than the simple hero and villain narrative popular history often assigns them. Mary was, by most accounts, the first woman to successfully claim and hold the English throne against determined opposition, proving that female rule was possible in an age that deeply doubted it, a precedent that arguably paved the way for Elizabeth's own accession to be accepted with far less resistance than it might otherwise have faced. Mary also enacted financial and administrative reforms that Elizabeth's government would later build upon. And Elizabeth, for all her reputation as the tolerant, moderate monarch, presided over her own executions of Catholic priests and used her own machinery of state repression against those she saw as threats to her rule and her church. Neither woman was simply good or simply monstrous. Both were products of a violent, unstable century in which religious identity was inseparable from political survival, and in which losing a succession struggle did not simply mean losing a job, it could mean losing your head. What makes the rivalry between Mary and Elizabeth so gripping, even nearly 5 centuries later, is not simply that they disagreed on religion or that one imprisoned the other. It is that they were bound together by blood, by a shared and traumatic childhood, at the hands of the same volatile father, by the same brutal court where their own mothers had been discarded and destroyed. And yet they ended up as the two poles around which England's entire religious and political identity would swing violently back and forth. Every time one sister triumphed, the other's life, faith, and very identity were placed in mortal danger. Mary's rise meant Elizabeth's imprisonment. Elizabeth's rise meant the dismantling of everything Mary had spent her reign building. There was, in the end, no version of this story where both women could fully win. When Elizabeth finally died in 1603, after 4.5 decades on the throne, she was buried at Westminster Abbey, in the same tomb as her half-sister Mary, an arrangement made later by their successor, King James, who commissioned a single monument to hold them both, inscribed with a Latin epitaph that translates roughly to a reminder that they were partners in throne and grave, here resting in the hope of one resurrection. It is a strange, almost poetic postscript to a relationship defined for most of their lives by fear, suspicion, and religious war. Two sisters torn apart by their father's ambitions and their own competing claims to power, ultimately laid to rest together for eternity. Their rivalry did not just decide which of them would rule. It decided, in ways that echo through the English language, English religion, and English culture to this very day, what kind of country England would become. And it all began with 2 little girls, born 7 years apart, to a father who wanted a son. Each of them told, at different points in their childhood, that they were nothing more than a bastard, with no claim to anything at all.